A glint of silver caught the light as the demolition crew cleared the rotting floorboards of an old barn. It wasn't much, just a tarnished belt buckle engraved with initials that had long faded but were still unmistakable. J.W. The memories it stirred were sharp, cutting through years of silence and uncertainty. But despite its reappearance, the town's questions remained unanswered. Why had it been hidden beneath the boards for so long? And what happened to the young man who had worn it so proudly? Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from in the comments and hit like and subscribe if you believe some names should never fade. It was a hot, dry summer in Phillips County, Kansas, one of those mornings where the sun beats down relentlessly on the fields, turning the soil to dust. The land stretched wide and endless, dotted with patches of green and the occasional barn where the rhythm of farm life never stopped. I grew up in a place like this, and life felt as steady as the rustle of dry corn stalks in the wind. People around here didn't make a lot of noise, but when something out of the ordinary happened, you could feel it in the air like a storm on the horizon. Back in 1986, things were simple, almost predictable. My mornings usually began with the hum of the coffee pot and the sound of my boots scraping the floor as I got ready for another long day. Most folks, like Jacob Whitmore, worked hard out in the fields, content to finish their day and settle into the comfort of routine. Jacob, a quiet farmhand, had been part of the landscape for a while, as dependable as the tractor he'd drive across the dusty fields. I remember him well. His mom, Ruth, had raised him on that farm just outside of town, and though he was grown and worked for the farmer up the road, he always came home for supper. His hands were strong from work, his face often dusted with the fine dirt of the fields, but you could always catch a smile behind those tired eyes. He was the kind of kid who didn't stir up much trouble, but knew how to keep his head down and get things done. The evening of June 24th started like any other. The sun had begun to set, and the long shadows of the barn stretched over the land. Jacob had spent the day working as usual, baling hay under the blistering heat. By the time dusk fell, he was tired, but in good spirits, joking with the other hands about grabbing a cold beer at the corner bar to cool off. His gloves, stained with the marks of the day's labor, lay neatly beside his jacket on the hay bale, the worn leather still holding the faint smell of tobacco and earth. The last person to see him that night was the farmer's son, a young man no older than 18. He'd been the one to close the barn door after Jacob, who had waved to him before walking off into the gathering night. It was a simple gesture, a wave that meant little at the time, but would soon become the last sign of life from Jacob. By morning there was no sign of him. His gloves were still there, his jacket folded as though he planned to return. But Jacob, the steady, reliable farmhand, had vanished. It was strange at first, just a quiet concern among Ruth and the folks who worked with him. People figured maybe he had gone out for a walk, or maybe he'd spent the night camping by the creek, a place he liked to visit when the weather was warm. But when the hours passed and Jacob didn't show up, Ruth's concern turned to worry. She called around, but no one had seen him. I remember when she came into town, her face drawn with a mix of disbelief and quiet panic. She sat on the porch of their small home just outside of town, holding the last photo anyone had taken of Jacob. It was one of those old Polaroids, Jacob leaning against a tractor with a shy grin, the summer sun dancing on his worn hat and his silver belt buckle gleaming in the sunlight. His initials, J.W., were etched into the buckle, a gift from his father when he turned 20. Ruth pressed that photo into the hands of the deputies when they arrived, clutching it like it was the last connection she had to her son. Jacob wouldn't just leave, she said, her voice steady but breaking. He wouldn't do this. The search began with a few locals and Ruth's neighbors. Trucks lined the dusty gravel roads, and the searchlights cut through the darkness sweeping over the fields and the creek bed. Deputies combed the land looking for any sign of where Jacob had gone, but the ground offered no answers. The bloodhounds followed his scent from the barn into the pasture, and then nothing. The trail ended. Just like that, he had vanished. In the days that followed, I kept hearing Ruth's words echoing in my mind. He wouldn't leave. But the more I thought about it, the more I began to wonder. Could something have happened that night? The barn had always seemed like a place where time stood still. It was old, the walls sagging from years of wear, but still functional, still standing, still holding secrets, maybe. But there was something else, something no one spoke of aloud at first. The barn, that very place where Jacob had worked day after day, seemed to carry an uneasy weight. People in town whispered that things didn't feel right inside it, especially at night. It was an odd thing to say, but when you've lived in a place long enough, you get a sense for when things are off. Maybe it was the barn's age or the way it groaned in the wind, but even I had felt it, the kind of unease that settles in your bones and lingers like a shadow that follows you wherever you go. The hours passed, the search went on, but Jacob's absence didn't make sense. It wasn't just that he was gone, it was that he had vanished like smoke in the wind. No signs of struggle. No clues to explain why he wasn't coming home. It was one of those quiet moments that lingers in your memory. A phone call that didn't come. A porch light that stayed on waiting for someone who never arrived. No one knew it yet, but that's when the storm began to gather. Just a small detail, an empty porch, a light left on a photo tucked into the hands of a grieving mother, but it marked the beginning of something none of us were ready for. And soon, we would all be asking the same question. Where did Jacob go? The day Jacob Whitmore disappeared, there were no signs, no warnings, nothing that seemed out of place. It was a late June afternoon, the kind that holds the heat of the sun deep into the evening, making everything feel a little heavy, like the air itself is thick with the promise of another long, dry summer. The field stretched out in every direction, endless and dry, with the sound of cicadas filling the stillness. I remember that evening because it wasn't supposed to be the start of anything. Just another typical night in a small Kansas town tucked away between the flatlands and the horizon. Jacob had finished his work for the day, the sweat on his brow a clear sign of the effort he'd put in under the relentless sun. The barn had become his refuge, his space to wind down after hours spent hauling hay, checking fences, and tending to whatever else needed doing. It was the place he always went to, no matter how tired he was. I'd seen him there many times, long after the sun had dipped below the horizon. His shadow cast long and thin in the fading light as he moved between the rows of bales, straightening things up and making sure everything was in order. That's how he was always taking care of the small things that others might overlook. The last person who saw him was the farmer's son, just a boy, really. He'd been finishing up the day's work and said goodbye to Jacob as he closed the big barn door behind him. A simple wave, a quiet gesture. Nothing unusual. No sense that it would be the last time anyone saw Jacob standing there. The wave seemed nothing more than routine, a simple exchange between two people who shared space, who knew the rhythm of this place like the back of their hands. But that was the last thing anyone would say about Jacob. When morning came, the barn looked exactly the same as it had the night before, except for one thing: Jacob wasn't there. His gloves were still on the hay bale, just as he'd left them. His jacket, folded neatly, was waiting for him to return, like everything was in its right place. But Jacob gone. I remember Ruth, his mother, coming into town later that day. I'd seen her around for years. She always had a calmness about her, that kind of quiet strength that doesn't make a fuss, but is steady in the face of whatever life throws at her. But when she came into the sheriff's office that morning, her face told a different story. There was no calm in her eyes. There was only confusion. Fear, the kind of fear a mother carries when she knows something's wrong but can't quite put her finger on what it is. She told me, her hands shaking just a little, Jacob wouldn't just leave Jack. He wouldn't. It wasn't a question. It was a certainty. She wasn't asking anyone to believe her. She was telling us because she knew her son. And I believed her. I couldn't imagine it either. Not Jacob. Not the kind of man who lived by his word and showed up day in and day out even when it was hard. So we set out. The sheriff's department pulled in all the resources we could get our hands on. We brought in the bloodhounds, and I can still hear their feet padding across the gravel as we led them toward the barn. They followed his scent going from the barn doors across the pasture where it stopped just like that, a trail that ended in a patch of tall grass leaving nothing but a lingering sense of wrongness. It wasn't just the dogs. It was the feeling. Everyone felt it. The town was small, and when something like this happens, it rattles the bones of a community. People showed up in droves. Farmers who had spent their entire day in the fields were suddenly pulling trucks out of their driveways, headlights cutting through the night as they searched the land. Some walked the ditches with flashlights. Others combed the creek beds with their boots sinking into the mud, praying to find something, anything that could explain where Jacob had gone. But there was nothing. No sign of a struggle. No blood. No footprints that led anywhere. It was as if he had just walked off the earth itself. And that feeling of nothingness, it stayed. Ruth didn't want to believe that her son had simply walked away, but the evidence, or the lack of it, made it hard to ignore. We searched every place we could think of. The small motels in neighboring towns, the bus stations, the truck stops. Every lead fizzled out before it could even catch a spark. But there was always the question hanging over us. What happened in that barn? People in town had their theories, as they always do. Some whispered that Jacob had gotten caught up in something ugly, something to do with wages or maybe debts he'd owed. It was a hard town to make a living in, and some folks weren't exactly kind to someone who was as vocal as Jacob about fair pay. Others swore he just ran off tired of the small-town life. But Ruth wasn't buying any of it. She'd known Jacob too long to believe that. Her faith in her son's character wasn't something that would be shaken by rumors, even if they grew louder with each passing day. Weeks turned into months, and the case slowly faded into the background like a ripple on a pond that gradually disappears. Jacob's picture stayed on the sheriff's office bulletin board, yellowing at the edges over time. His disappearance became part of the town's quiet history, like the old barns that had fallen into disrepair or the fields that lay dormant. There was still talk in diners, in the bar, in the quiet corners of people's homes, but the hope of finding any answers was slipping away. Ruth, though, she never gave up. She kept Jacob's room just the way it had been, his boots lined up by the door, his jacket slung over a chair, and the radio always tuned to his favorite country station still crackled in the background. Every night, Ruth left the porch light on just in case. I remember her telling me once, sitting on that porch in the dark, "He'll come home, Jack. He'll come back." And I wanted to believe her, but something inside me knew we were all just waiting for something that wasn't going to happen. And then, 15 years later, everything changed. The old barn where Jacob had worked, the one that still seemed to hold his presence, was set to be torn down. The new owner had let it fall into ruin, and it was time to make room for something new. They brought in the demolition crew, the first step in taking the barn apart and moving it out of the way. I don't think anyone could have predicted what they'd find. I know I didn't. I'd heard the rumors, of course, about the strange things that had happened there over the years. People swore the barn was haunted, that Jacob's spirit still lingered inside. I always thought it was just talk, the kind of thing that pops up in a small town where nothing ever really changes. But when that crew tore up the floorboards, they found something I hadn't expected, something that would pull the town's quiet history back into the light. It was just a belt buckle, tarnished by time, covered in dirt. But the initials were unmistakable. J.W. And suddenly, the past wasn't just a memory. It was something alive again, waiting to be unraveled. That belt buckle, though it raised more questions than it answered. How had it ended up there, buried beneath those old boards? Who had put it there? And why I stood in the empty lot where the barn once stood, listening to the wind that cut through the empty space. And all I could think was, What else is still buried out there? The discovery of Jacob's belt buckle and pocket knife stirred something in the town. At first, it was just a few whispered conversations in diners and barber shops. But over time, those whispers grew louder as people began to wonder what it all meant. For 15 years, the case had been forgotten, or at least pushed to the back of our minds. It was just another small-town mystery, a missing person no one could solve. But the belt buckle there, it was right beneath our noses, buried in the floorboards of the barn where Jacob had worked. A part of him had been waiting there all along, and now we had to figure out why. The sheriff called me in the day they found the buckle. The phone call was quick, like he didn't want to say too much over the line, but I could hear the urgency in his voice. I grabbed my coat and left my office, heading straight to the old barn. I remember the sound of my boots crunching on the gravel, the air dry and hot as it always was during the summer months. The town felt still, as though time had decided to stand still for a moment, waiting for something to happen. But when I arrived, the place was already crawling, with deputies' cameras clicking and questions hanging heavy in the air. I pushed through the crowd, walking toward the barn, the weight of the day pressing down on me. They'd already pulled up the floorboards, revealing the items hidden below the tarnished buckle and the rusted knife. The deputies were still sifting through the dirt, trying to understand what they'd found, trying to piece together how those items had been buried for so long without anyone knowing. I didn't know what to make of it either. On one hand, there was a strange sense of closure in seeing Jacob's things again. After all these years, there was a tangible connection to him, a link to his disappearance that hadn't existed before. But on the other hand, the discovery raised more questions than it answered. How had they gotten there? Why had they been hidden? And most importantly, what happened to Jacob? The town's pulse quickened as word spread. By the time the items were taken to the sheriff's office, there was a crowd gathered outside, people standing in the heat, their voices low but full of disbelief. Ruth was there too. She had been called in after the discovery, and when they showed her the buckle, her face fell. She didn't cry. There wasn't much crying left for her after all those years. But I could see it in her eyes, the weight of it all. She had never stopped believing that Jacob hadn't just run away. She had always known there was more to the story, something buried deep under the surface. And now, standing in front of his buckle, there was a painful confirmation that she hadn't been wrong. That was the moment the case shifted from being a missing persons case to something more, something darker. The questions were piling up, but we still had no answers. The barn was old, and it had stood there for years, creaking and groaning with age, its foundation sinking deeper into the earth. People in town had always joked about the place being haunted. Some said they heard strange noises coming from inside at night. Others swore they could feel Jacob's presence when they worked in the fields near the barn. There was always something eerie about that place, something unsettling that no one could quite put their finger on. Ruth, standing there, clutching the photograph of Jacob with that same buckle gleaming on his waist, couldn't bring herself to say much. But what she did say stuck with me. This proves he didn't run away, Jack. This proves he didn't leave us on purpose. I watched her wipe her eyes, her voice breaking just a little. It was the first time I'd seen her like that, raw, vulnerable, searching for something in those objects that had been buried for so long. But Ruth wasn't the only one with questions. The sheriff was facing his own battle. He had to go public with this discovery, had to explain it to the press, to the town, to anyone who had been watching. But there was so little to say. We knew Jacob's belongings had been hidden beneath the floorboards, but that didn't explain why. The only thing we could be certain of was that someone had placed them there. Someone had gone to the trouble of prying up the floorboards and tucking those items inside, and that person had never come forward. The idea that Jacob might have hidden his own belongings seemed unlikely, especially for someone who had been so attached to that buckle. No, this didn't feel like a simple case of a man who had left his life behind. This was something else. I spent the next few weeks talking to the demolition crew, trying to piece together exactly what had happened when they uncovered the buckle and the knife. They had been careful. I'll give them that. The men who found the items had called in the sheriff right away, not wanting to disturb the scene. But it was clear that the objects had been deliberately hidden. The floorboards above them had been intact for years, untouched by time until the demolition began. Whoever had placed them there had done so with intent, a fact that weighed heavily on all of us. Theories began to spread. Some people wondered if Jacob himself had hidden his things, maybe in an attempt to start fresh, to leave behind the life he had in Phillips County. But those who knew Jacob rejected that idea outright. He wasn't the kind of person who would just disappear without a word. He loved that buckle. It was a gift from his father, something he had worn proudly since he was 20. It was a part of him. No, something had happened in that barn. Something had gone wrong, and whoever had been involved in it wasn't telling the truth. As I sat there going through the evidence, I felt the weight of all the years that had passed. Ruth had waited so long for an answer, for a sign that Jacob hadn't just walked away. And now here it was, but it was only half an answer. The buckle and the knife were relics objects that proved Jacob had been there, but they didn't explain why he was gone. And then there were the questions about the barn itself. Could the barn have been complicit in all of this? Some said it had been silent all these years, holding on to secrets that no one dared to uncover. Others wondered if the building had been a sort of grave, a place where the truth had been buried alongside the wood and dirt. The more I thought about it, the more I started to wonder if the barn had been more than just a structure. Had it been a witness, or had it been something darker, a place where something had been hidden and forgotten? I didn't know the answer. The sheriff didn't either. All we had were more questions. As we continued to look into the barn and the people who had been involved with it, we found ourselves back where we started, no closer to the truth than we had been when Jacob first disappeared. But now the town was changing. People were looking at each other differently, wondering who might have known more than they let on. And Ruth. She had to live with the discovery of her son's things, but the thing she wanted most, her son, was still missing. I'd always heard stories about the barn, of course. Small towns have their whispers, their rumors, and the old barns seemed to gather more than their fair share. People talked about strange feelings when they worked in there alone. Some said they heard footsteps at night even when no one was supposed to be inside. Others spoke about the faint smell of tobacco drifting through the rafters, like Jacob himself still haunted the place. Maybe it was just the place's age, the creaks and groans of wood that had been standing for years, keeping secrets in its dust. But when Jacob's things were found buried beneath the floorboards, those stories suddenly seemed real. It was like the barn had been holding on to something for all those years, waiting for the right time to release it. I spent days thinking about that barn, about the silence it had kept, and about what it had known. After the discovery, the air in the town felt different. People were on edge, not knowing who to trust. Every conversation seemed to be about Jacob, about the discovery of his buckle, about what had really happened in that barn. Ruth came to see me soon after, sitting in my office, her hands folded in her lap. She hadn't given up, not in all these years. But now there was a new kind of weight in her eyes, something darker. She wasn't just looking for answers anymore. She was looking for someone to hold accountable. She asked me, "Do you think Jacob had enemies?" "Jack. Do you think someone hurt him?" And that's when it hit me like a wave crashing over the shore. Of course there were people who didn't like Jacob. There were people who didn't like anyone who spoke out. Jacob had been stubborn about wages, demanding fair pay from the farm owner. Some folks weren't too happy with that, but I'd never thought of it as enough to cause something like this. But now, after what had been uncovered, after the buckle, the knife, things had changed. And those questions Ruth was asking weren't so easy to ignore. I knew the farm where Jacob had worked, the land that stretched out for miles. It wasn't a big operation, not by the standards of some of the larger farms around here, but it was enough to get by enough to give someone like Jacob a stable job. He wasn't the kind of guy who stirred up trouble, but he wasn't afraid to stand his ground when he needed to. I had to admit, the more I thought about it, the more that theory about a hidden argument, something going wrong in that barn, made sense. But there was no blood, no evidence of violence. The barn itself had given us nothing but silence. We'd gone over the details of that night 100 times. The last person to see Jacob had been the farmer's son, just a kid who'd closed the barn doors behind him and headed back to the house. No one had heard a thing. No loud voices, no scuffle. It was as though Jacob had simply disappeared, like he had stepped off the earth without a trace. The search efforts had gone on for weeks, then months, then years. People had said everything. Maybe he was just tired of small-town life. Maybe he'd gone to find something more somewhere else. But no one had truly believed it. Certainly not Ruth. After the discovery of Jacob's buckle and knife, everything began to stir again. The sheriff called in extra deputies. Everyone was asking the same thing. Who had put them there? How had those items ended up hidden beneath the barn's floorboards? We scoured through records of the barn's history, asking questions we'd never asked before. The building had stood there for so long, its beams sagging under the weight of time, but we had never thought to look inside it like this. Maybe that's because the barn was just another piece of the background, a fixture in the landscape of the town. It never occurred to anyone that it might have been hiding something far worse than old hay or tools. But once we had those items in our hands, we couldn't ignore the fact that someone had deliberately placed them there. The more we looked into the barn's history, the more questions we found. There were a few people who had worked in that barn, some of whom had left under strange circumstances. People had come and gone. The farm had changed hands a couple of times, but there was always a sense of unease tied to that old structure. The workers who had been there when Jacob disappeared had no more answers than the rest of us. They all had the same story, nothing unusual, nothing strange. But if that was the case, why had the buckle and the knife been buried in the first place? It wasn't just the barn. It was the very fact that the objects had been hidden, and hidden carefully. Someone had gone to a great deal of trouble to cover something up. Ruth came by the sheriff's office that evening just like she had every year, holding on to her son's photo like a lifeline. She had always refused to believe Jacob had run away. And I could see why. Even now, with the discovery of his belongings, there was no sense of closure. There was only more silence, only more unanswered questions. Ruth asked again, almost pleading this time. "Do you think he was hurt in that barn, Jack? Do you think he's still out there somewhere?" It was the same question she had been asking for 15 years, the one that hung over her like a cloud that never went away. But now, with the buckle in front of us, with the knife, that question was sharper than it had ever been. In the weeks that followed, the sheriff's office began to look at everyone a little differently. Theories flew around town like they always do. The obvious one was that someone Jacob trusted had done something to him, hurt him inside that barn, and then covered it up. But there were other theories, darker ones, that suggested someone had taken matters into their own hands for reasons no one could explain. And all the while, the town held its breath, caught between a discovery that didn't quite make sense and a mystery that felt like it was pulling them in. I remember walking through the empty lot where the barn used to stand, looking at the bare ground where Jacob had worked. It felt strange to stand there to know that something so significant had once been hidden under its boards, buried in the dirt. The barn was gone now, torn down in a matter of days, leaving nothing but a patch of earth and the echoes of what had been. But those echoes lingered. And they didn't just belong to the barn. They belonged to Jacob, too. The weight of the unanswered questions was still there, still pressing down on us. And as much as I tried to move forward to find a way to put this all behind me, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something still hidden beneath the earth, something we hadn't found yet. The barn, once a symbol of the past, was now just an empty patch of earth. The place where Jacob Whitmore had last worked had been torn down, and in its absence the town had begun to breathe again. But it was a different kind of air, thick with memories, with what-ifs, and with questions that had never fully been answered. I'd spent my life in small towns, watching the seasons change in the same fields, watching families rise and fall, and hearing stories drift through the streets like the wind. But Jacob's story, his disappearance, was different. It hadn't been just another local mystery, not like the others that had come and gone. No, Jacob's absence had shaped everything that came after. It had shaped Ruth's life, a mother's grief that never truly went away. It had shaped the community too, because no matter how much time had passed, no matter how much people had tried to move on, there was always a shadow where the barn once stood, always a question about what happened to that boy who simply vanished. I stood there looking at the bare ground, the dust still swirling where the barn used to be. There had been a time when I believed the barn held the answers. I thought that if we just dug enough, if we just searched long enough, the truth would come to light. But it hadn't. The buckle and knife Jacob's belongings were supposed to be the key, the sign that we were finally getting somewhere. But all they gave us was more silence. And silence, as I learned, is its own kind of answer. It tells you that some things are too deep to unearth no matter how hard you try. Ruth, who had held on to her son's memory for so long, never really let go, not even after everything that came to light. She visited the sheriff's office a few weeks after the discovery, her hand still clutching that photograph of Jacob. She didn't need to say much, not anymore. When she looked at the buckle, she looked at a part of Jacob she could hold on to. But it wasn't enough. It would never be enough. She never got the closure she needed, the answer she deserved. And I couldn't give her that, no matter how much I wished I could. I saw her again a few months later, sitting on the porch of her house, the light from the fading sun casting long shadows across the front yard. She didn't seem any different. She still kept Jacob's room the same, still left the porch light on every night. There was a quiet sadness in her eyes, but there was also a strength, a refusal to let the world move on without remembering her son. She said it to me once, and I'll never forget it. You can't move on, Jack, not when you don't know the whole story. Not when you don't know what happened to him. I understood. But time doesn't stop, no matter how hard you try to hold on to it. Years go by. People get older. The world moves on, and the questions fade into the background, no matter how loud they seem in the moment. The town tried to forget. The sheriff's office closed the case. Deputies who had worked on it moved on to other things. The photograph of Jacob on the bulletin board faded, yellowing at the edges, the corners curling with time. And yet, despite the passage of years, despite the way life went on for everyone else, I couldn't help but wonder what had happened that night in the barn, who had hidden Jacob's things there, and why we'll never know. Not for sure. All we have are the relics, the buckle, the knife, the memory of a boy who worked the land and a mother who never stopped looking for him. Those are the things that remained, the things that kept Jacob alive in the minds of those who remembered him. I think about Jacob sometimes, standing there in the sun, the buckle gleaming against his worn shirt. He was just a young man caught between the world he knew and the world he might have wanted to find. He was stubborn, yes, but he was also just trying to make sense of his place in the world, trying to do the right thing, trying to stand up for what he believed in. I wonder if he had any idea what his disappearance would do to the people who loved him. I wonder if when he left the barn that night he had any idea that the last thing he'd ever do would be walk out of that door his back to the world and disappear into the dark. And I wonder too if the truth is really buried beneath the dirt, if the silence really tells the whole story, or if there's something more. Something the barn never gave up. But there's no point in chasing it anymore. The earth won't give up its secrets. Not for us, not for anyone. And maybe that's just the way it goes. Some questions can never be answered, and some truths can never be unearthed. So life moved on. People moved away. New families moved in. The farm changed hands a couple of times, as farms do. The old barn, now nothing but a memory, became part of the town's folklore. People talked about it in hushed voices the way towns do about things they can't explain. But there were no more searches, no more questions. Ruth's life went on too, though I'm sure it was quieter, more empty. I heard she eventually sold the house and moved to a smaller place somewhere where the memories didn't hurt so much. I don't know if she ever got over it. I don't think anyone can. We live with what we have, and we make peace with the things we can't change. For me, I never forgot the case. Even after I left the sheriff's department, I carried it with me. The buckle, the knife, the way Ruth looked at me that day holding Jacob's picture, still believing that one day somehow the truth would come out. I never did find the answer she was looking for. None of us did. But I think sometimes that's the hardest thing of all. To live with a question you know will never have an answer. But maybe that's just the way of things. If this story stayed with you, share it not for views, but so no one's name gets lost to the dark.